My name is Alina, and if you looked at my life from the outside, you would probably think I have everything a woman could desire. I live in an impressive mansion near Cascais, surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens, and a staff always ready to attend to my every need. My closet overflows with designer dresses, custom shoes, and jewelry that shines brighter than the stars themselves. But this perfection is merely an illusion. My world is a golden cage, and though surrounded by luxury, I remain a prisoner. My husband Victor is a powerful man, respected and feared. A business tycoon, accustomed to having everything under his control. When I married him, I was young, naive, and full of dreams. I thought he would be my knight in shining armor, someone who would protect and cherish me. It didn't take long to discover that his love was merely a mask, hiding something much darker. Victor is charming in public, always smiling and generous. But at home, he transforms into a tyrant. "Don't forget this, Alina," he often says with a cold stare, gripping my arm so tightly that I can feel his fingers marking my skin. "If you try to escape, you'll pay a very steep price." His words are always a threat. Once, when I tried to question him, his reaction was so violent that I became afraid to open my mouth again. It's not just me who lives under his dominion. The entire household staff, from the cook to the gardener, all behave as if they're walking a tightrope, fearing his anger. Despite everything, my appearance must remain flawless. Victor demands that I always look perfect. My days are filled with visits to beauty salons, spa sessions, and shopping for clothes, while I feel like I'm drowning in an empty routine. My dresses are elegant, made of silk and lace, fitted at the waist with subtle necklines that show just enough, but never too much. I wear high heels that elongate my silhouette but don't allow me to run. Ironic, isn't it? Yet the greatest humiliation isn't his control, it's his indifference. Victor never hides his affairs. His mistresses come and go, some with the audacity to look at me with contempt when I encounter them at social events. On these occasions, I can only force a smile and pretend nothing is happening. But everything changed the day he arrived. It was a warm June morning, and the sun shone brilliantly over the gardens. I was on the veranda, dressed in a white linen dress and golden sandals, sipping coffee when I first saw him. He was in the garden, inspecting the plants alongside the head gardener. It was impossible not to notice him. He had dark curly hair, slightly tousled, as if the wind had been playing with it. His skin was bronzed with a golden tone that accentuated every muscle of his body under the sun. He wore work overalls with straps, revealing his strong, defined arms. And his eyes were such a deep blue that they made me forget how to breathe for a moment. His name was Marco, a young man of 23, who had arrived from the small villages of Alento in search of work. There was something about him that radiated vitality afresh, living energy that contrasted so starkly with the oppression of my life that I could unhelp feeling an immediate attraction. I didn't know why, but I found myself inventing excuses to spend more time on the veranda. From my spot, I could watch him move, clean, prune branches, and work with what seemed like genuine passion. Each time his gaze crossed mine, I quickly averted my eyes, feeling like a girl caught doing something forbidden. That day, when he looked at me again, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, a flutter of excitement. For the first time in a very long time, I wondered if it was still possible to feel alive. From the day I first saw him, Marco began to occupy all my thoughts. It was as if a window had been opened in my golden cage, and the fresh air rushing in made me feel alive after years of suffocation. I found any excuse to spend more time on the veranda or in the garden, observing him from afar as he worked. Every morning I carefully chose my outfit, selecting dresses that enhanced my figure, hoping he would notice. One particularly hot afternoon, I decided I could no longer limit myself to merely watching him. I put on a light cream silk dress that molded to my body, with exposed shoulders and a skirt that brushed against my knees. My high golden sandals completed the ensemble, along with long earrings that accentuated my neck. For the first time in a long time, I felt beautiful, and this sensation filled me with an excitement I thought I had lost forever. That afternoon, as the sun began to slowly set, I prepared a pitcher of cold lemonade and took it to the garden. Marco was busy pruning some rose bushes. His t-shirt clung to his back with sweat, his bronze skin glistened in the evening light, and each of his movements seemed hypnotic to me. I approached him with my heart pounding, feeling a chill in my stomach. "Good afternoon, Marco," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, despite a slight tremor. "I brought something to help you cool down. It's unbearably hot today, isn't it?" He turned to look at me, and for a moment I lost myself in his deep blue eyes. He smiled shyly, while wiping his hands on a cloth. "Thank you very much, Miss Alina," he quickly added, remembering that I had asked him to call me by my name. Extended the glass, and when our hands touched, I felt a spark run through my body. He took a sip, and then ran his tongue over his lips to clean a drop that had escaped. It was such a simple gesture, but at that moment, it seemed incredibly intimate. "Do you always work this hard?" I asked, trying to prolong the conversation. "It's what I love to do, Miss Alina," he replied with a slight smile. "The earth never betrays you." His words left a knot in my throat. I lowered my gaze, trying to hide the emotion he had awakened in me. After that day, our meetings became more frequent. Whenever he was in the garden, I found a reason to go out. He would sit under the shade of the olive trees and talk for hours. Marco told me stories of his childhood in a small village in Alanteo, of his dreams of one day having his own farm, and of how he missed his family. I, in turn, spoke about my life, my fears, and my loneliness. It was strange, but with him, I felt like I could be myself. I wasn't Victor's wife or a decorative figure in a mansion. I was simply Alina, a woman who was beginning to rediscover herself. One day, while teaching me how to care for the roses, he said something that left me speechless. "Alina, you're like these roses, beautiful, but it seems someone keeps you caged." I looked at him, surprised, unable to respond. His sincerity disarmed me, and for a moment, I felt that he saw through me like no one had in years. Gradually, the tension between us began to grow. One day, I wore a red silk dress, one of my favorites that left my shoulders exposed and accentuated my waist. When I went down to the garden, I noticed Marco looking at me differently. Odd. It was as if his eyes were searching for every detail, every curve. "You look beautiful," he said in a low voice, almost as if he didn't want me to hear.
"Thank you, Marco,"
I replied, feeling my cheeks burn. That afternoon, as he worked in the garden, I approached closer than usual. At one point, our hands accidentally touched as I tried to reach for a tool. It was a brief touch, but loaded with meaning. I looked into his eyes and saw something in his gaze that made me tremble, desire mixed with a hint of fear. That night, as I tried to sleep, I couldn't stop thinking about him. My mind was filled with images: his strong hands, his intense eyes, his shy smile. I found myself caught between fear and desire, between what was right and what was inevitable. The next day, I went to the garden, hoping to see him. When we finally crossed paths, it was he who broke the silence. "Alina, I need to tell you something," he began, but I interrupted him, placing a finger gently on his lips. This gesture was spontaneous, but at that moment, I felt there was no turning back. The desire that had been consuming us finally caught up with us. That afternoon in the garden, everything changed between Marco and me. That impromptu touch, the brush of my fingers against his lips, wasn't just an impulsive gesture. It was the moment when our lives, until then, separated by invisible barriers, began to intertwine in a way that neither of us could ignore. I felt alive as never before, and this feeling was as intoxicating as it was dangerous. That night, while Victor was busy in his office with one of his endless business calls, I decided to take a walk in the garden. The cool night breeze caressed my skin, and the scent of night-blooming flowers permeated the air. I wore an ivory silk nightgown that fell softly over my body, covering me just enough, and carried a transparent shawl to protect me from the cold. I didn't expect to find Marco, but there he was, working under the soft light of a lamp illuminating one of the paths. Hearing my footsteps, he raised his head and saw me. For a moment, neither of us said anything. His gaze traveled over my figure, and I felt the heat rise to my cheeks. "I didn't think you'd be out here at this hour," I said, breaking the silence. "Sometimes the garden needs care even at night," he responded, moving a little closer. His voice was low, almost a whisper. We stood there looking at each other amid the silence. The moonlight illuminated his face. I could see every detail: the drops of sweat glistening on his forehead, the slight curve of his smile, the intensity in his eyes. I felt vulnerable, but at the same time, I desired this vulnerability. "You shouldn't be here, Alina," he finally said, although his tone wasn't reproachful but concerned. "Perhaps I shouldn't be, but I am," I replied, taking a step toward him. Marco didn't move. His gaze was fixed on me, as if he were struggling with himself. Finally, he raised a hand and gently pushed aside a strand of hair that had fallen over my face. This small gesture was enough to make my heart race. "You're incredibly beautiful," he murmured, almost inaudible, but his words struck me deeply. The moment seemed eternal, suspended in time. Finally, as if something invisible was pushing us, our lips met. It was a gentle kiss, almost timid at first, but full of emotion. I felt his warmth, his restrained strength, and a passion that had been repressed in me for years. The kiss lingered, and when we finally separated, we were both breathless. "Tut!" Marco looked at me as if he wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. "This is madness, Alina," he finally said, "but I can't help it." "Neither can I replied, knowing I had crossed a boundary from which there would be no return. From that night on, everything changed. Our glances became more intense, our conversations more intimate, and our meetings more frequent. Marco began working in the garden closer to the house, and I found any excuse to go out and see him. One afternoon, while he was working in the greenhouse, I decided to approach him. I wore a light cotton dress with thin straps that left my shoulders exposed and sandals that barely made a sound as I walked. The summer heat made the air heavy, and as I entered, the aroma of flowers and damp earth enveloped me. "Alina," he said, surprised to see me. His hands were covered in soil, but that didn't stop him from coming closer. "You shouldn't be here," he said softly. "I know," I replied with a smile, "but I wanted to see you." We stood there, so close that I could feel the heat from his body. With a trembling hand, he lightly touched my cheek, and I closed my eyes, savoring the moment. Gradually, his hand moved down, tracing my neck and shoulder until he finally held my hand. "I can't stay away from you," he said, with a mixture of passion and despair in his voice. "You don't have to," I responded, and at that instant, I knew I was willing to risk everything. The greenhouse became our refuge. The light that filtered through the glass cast shadows over us as we embraced for the first time. His hands were strong, yet gentle, and each of his touches seemed to ignite a spark within me. We didn't need words. Everything we felt was in our gazes, in our gestures, in the way our breaths mingled. Although our encounters were brief, each one made me feel more alive. With him, I wasn't just a woman. I was someone who was beginning to dream again, to desire to live. Marco gave me back something I believed was lost forever. However, the more time we spent together, the more my fear grew that Victor might suspect something. He continued ignoring me, busy with his business and his mistresses, but I knew his wrath could be devastating if he discovered what was happening. One afternoon, as I prepared to go down to the garden, my heart stopped when I heard Victor calling me from his office. I entered, trying to stay calm, and saw him sitting in his large leather chair with an expression I couldn't decipher. "Alina, lately you seem distracted," he said, not taking his eyes off me. "Is there something you want to tell me?" I shook my head, fearing he could read my thoughts, but his gaze remained fixed on me as if searching for something he couldn't find. "I hope you remember what I once told you," he added coldly. "If you ever betray me, you'll pay a very high price." His words were like a blade, but I tried not to show any sign of weakness. I left his office with my heart racing, knowing that danger was closer than I had imagined. The weeks following our first encounter were the most intense and dangerous of my life. Marco and I saw each other more and more, but Victor's shadow was always present. A warning that our world could crumble at any moment. Our meetings became riskier each day. We sought new places to escape the prying eyes of the employees. Sometimes we met in the greenhouse, surrounded by the scent of flowers and the suffocating heat of the glass. Other times we waited until night when the house was silent and we met in the darkest corners of the garden. I remember one night in particular. The sky was clear, and the stars shone as never before. I wore a simple but elegant black silk dress with a neckline that exposed my collarbones. Marco waited for me by the garden fountain, with his shirt slightly unbuttoned and his hands in his pockets. When he saw me, his face lit up with a smile that, for a moment, made all my fear disappear. I approached him, and without saying a word, he wrapped me in his arms. The contact of his skin against mine was like a balm, something that made me forget everything else. "I can't keep seeing you like this, hiding all the time," he said as his fingers played with a strand of my hair. "You deserve better, Alina. You deserve to be free." "I'm willing to risk everything for you," I replied, knowing that every word was true. A few days later, while I was on the veranda having coffee, Victor suddenly entered with a serious expression on his face. His presence always filled the environment with a tension impossible to ignore. "Alina," he said, approaching slowly, "the staff has told me you've been spending a lot of time in the garden. Is there something I should know?" My heart stopped for an instant, but I managed to maintain my composure. I forced a smile and replied, "I'm just enjoying the fresh air, Victor. Nothing more." He observed me for a few seconds, as if trying to read my mind, then nodded, but he didn't seem convinced. "I hope that's true," he said coldly, "because you know what the consequences are of betraying me." When he left the room, my hands were trembling. I knew the danger was closer than ever, and any mistake could cost us dearly. That night, while I was with Marco in the greenhouse, I told him what had happened. His eyes filled with concern, and he took my hands in his. "We can't continue like this, Alina. It's too risky," he said with a determined tone. "We need to leave away from here, away from him." The idea of escaping was frightening, but also my only hope for freedom. Marco proposed a plan. We would gather all the money I could get, and we'd take the first flight to a place where Victor couldn't find us. "What if he finds us?" I asked with a knot in my throat, looking at Marco, looking at me with determination. "But even if he does, I won't let him hurt you. I promise to protect you." His promise filled me with a hope I hadn't felt in years. For the first time, I believed that freedom was possible. A few days before our escape plan, Victor organized a dinner at the mansion with some of his business partners. The house was full of lights, music, and forced laughter. I wore a long velvet dress in emerald green, with a cut that highlighted my silhouette. My hair was tied in an elegant bun, and the jewelry I wore sparkled with every movement. Inside, I was terrified. Victor didn't take his eyes off me all night, as if suspecting something. At one point, when we were alone, he leaned toward me and whispered, "Alina, remember this. Everything in my life is under my control, including you. Now, don't try to deceive me because you will lose." His words were a direct threat, and I felt as if time had stopped. When he walked away, my legs could barely support me. I knew I needed to act quickly before it was too late. On the night before our escape, I prepared everything necessary. I had hidden money in a small suitcase and chosen simple clothes to avoid attracting attention. Marco and I had arranged to meet at the back entrance of the mansion, where a car would be waiting for us. As I packed my things, I took one last look at my closet full of dresses, shoes, and jewelry. All those things that symbolized my perfect life now held no value for me. I closed the suitcase, took a deep breath, and prepared to face the unknown. The night of our escape finally arrived. The air was charged with tension, as if the mansion itself knew something was about to happen. The plan was simple. Marco and I would meet in the back garden, where a car would take us to the airport. We had reserved a flight at dawn to the Azores, a place where we hoped Victor couldn't find us. With my suitcase in one hand and my heart pounding wildly, I walked silently through the corridors of the house. Each creak of the floor seemed like a scream that could alert Victor or the staff. Finally, I reached the back garden, where Marco was already waiting for me. He wore simple clothes, a white t-shirt, jeans, and a light jacket. In his hands, he held a small backpack, where he probably carried the little he owned. "Are you ready?" he asked in a low voice, looking at me with concern. "More than ever," I replied, taking his hand. We ran toward the car, hidden by the darkness of the night. The driver, a friend of Marco's, was waiting with the engine running. When we got in, I felt a mixture of relief and fear. We were about to leave behind everything I knew, but also everything that had kept me prisoner. The journey to the airport was silent. Marco didn't let go of my hand for a moment, as if to remind me that I wasn't alone. However, fear was still present. Each light on the road seemed like a danger signal, each shadow a reminder that Victor could appear at any moment. Finally, we arrived at the airport and boarded the flight to the Azores. As the plane took off, I looked out the window and watched the lights of Lisbon disappear in the distance. It was at this moment that I finally allowed myself to breathe. We were safe, at least for now. In the weeks that followed, we began to build a new life in a small house near the beach. Marco got a job as a gardener at a hotel, while I started giving painting lessons to children in the local community. They were simple days, but full of happiness. For the first time since our escape, our life in the Azores had become a refuge, a place where time seemed to have stopped. But even in paradise, I couldn't completely forget Victor. I knew he never let anything escape his hands. One afternoon, while I was preparing dinner, I heard knocks at the door. Marco was working in the garden, and I thought it might be a neighbor. When I opened the door, the world seemed to stop. There stood Victor, his figure imposing, and his cold gaze pierced me like a knife. He wore an impeccable suit as always, but what terrified me most was the smile on his lips, that of a predator who had found his prey. "I warned you, Alina," he said with a calmness that made his voice even more frightening. "You'll pay a very high price for your betrayal." I tried to speak, but my throat was dry. My body was paralyzed with fear. At that moment, Marco appeared behind me, holding a shovel, his face full of confusion. "Who is this man?" he asked, looking at me with concern. "I'm the owner of what you tried to steal," replied Victor, taking a step forward, "and I've come to collect what's mine." Marco stepped forward, placing his body between Victor and me. I could see the fear in his eyes, but also the determination. "Alina is not something you can possess," Marco said firmly. "She is free." Victor let out a cold laugh, as if Marco's courage was amusing to him. "Free," he repeated with sarcasm. "She will never be free from me." Before I could react, Victor pulled something from his suit pocket, a small knife that glinted in the evening light. Everything happened in an instant. Marco tried to stop him, but Victor was faster. A scream escaped from my lips as Marco fell to the ground, clutching his side. "This is just the beginning, Alina," said Victor, looking directly into my eyes. "We'll see each other again." He left as quickly as he had arrived, leaving behind a terrifying silence. I knelt beside Marco, tears streaming down my face. Although the wound didn't seem fatal, the fear of losing him was tearing me apart. Hours passed before a local doctor could attend to Marco. Though he would recover, I knew nothing would ever be the same again. Victor had proven he could find us, that he would always be one step ahead. That night, as I sat beside Marco's bed, I could only think of one thing. How much longer could we run? And what price would I have to pay next time? Thank you for being with us on Trapped in Desire. Subscribe, like, and don't miss new stories.